Against all odds, how Ukraine defied history. In the pre-dawn darkness of February 24th, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy stood at his office window in Kyiv, watching a city that was about to change forever. His phone buzzed incessantly with intelligence reports, each more dire than the last. Russian tanks were crossing the border, missiles were in the air, and the world's second-largest military was bearing down on his country from 3 directions. The Americans had offered him a helicopter evacuation. The French promised asylum. Even his closest advisors urged him to relocate to Lviv in the safer western reaches of Ukraine. Every rational calculation, every historical precedent, every military analysis suggested that Kyiv would fall within days, if not hours. But in that moment, as air raid sirens began their haunting wail across the capital, Zelenskyy made a decision that would alter the course of the 21st century. "I need ammunition," he would famously tell the Americans, "not a ride." It was a choice that defied logic, yet defined a nation. Here was a former comedian, barely 3 years into his presidency, preparing to stare down Vladimir Putin's war machine. The same military analysts who had watched Russia's modernization over the previous decade gave Ukraine less than a week. They didn't understand that they were about to witness one of history's most extraordinary demonstrations of national resolve, a David and Goliath story for the modern age. What followed was not just a war, but a revolution in how wars are fought. Digital weapons deployed alongside traditional ones, social media wielded as skillfully as artillery, civilians with smartphones becoming intelligence assets, and a president who understood that in the age of TikTok and Twitter, information could be as powerful as tanks. This is the story of how a nation that many couldn't find on a map became the bulwark of democracy in Eastern Europe. It's a tale of innovative generals and ingenious civilians, of Western weapons and Ukrainian courage, of strategic genius and pure, stubborn defiance. Above all, it's a testament to how the Ukrainian people, facing extinction as a nation, found within themselves a steel that no one, not even they, knew they possessed. The odds against them were impossible. The stakes were existential. And in the end, they would rewrite every rule of modern warfare. This is how they did it. The making and resilience of modern Ukraine. The seeds of Ukraine's extraordinary resistance were planted long before the first Russian tanks crossed the border in 2022. They took root in the fertile black soil of the steppes, in centuries of stubborn independence, and, most crucially, in the transformative fires of 2014. On a frigid January morning that year, riot police faced off against protesters in Kyiv's Maidan Square. The air crackled with tension and tear gas as students, pensioners, and professionals stood their ground against then-President Viktor Yanukovych's security forces. They were fighting against more than just one leader's decision to reject closer ties with Europe. They were battling for Ukraine's soul. "We saw grandmothers bringing hot soup to protesters in sub-zero temperatures," recalled Maria Kovtu, a university student at the time. Doctors set up field hospitals in churches. E-professionals used their laptops to counter government propaganda. It wasn't an uprising, it was a nation discovering itself. The Revolution of Dignity, as it came to be known, would cost 108 lives and drive Yanukovych into Russian exile. But it delivered something priceless, a fierce sense of national identity separate from Russia's shadow. When protesters tore down Lenin statues across the country, they weren't just toppling Soviet monuments, they were dismantling centuries of imposed historical narrative. Putin's response was swift and brutal. Russia annexed Crimea and ignited a separatist war in the Donbas region. But these acts of aggression produced unintended consequences that would prove fatal to his later ambitions. Every Russian shell that fell on Ukrainian soil in 2014 helped forge the military that would later stop his army cold. Colonel Oleksandr Pavlyuk, then a mid-level officer, remembered the humiliation of those early days. "We had soldiers without body armor fighting with Soviet-era equipment," he said, "but we learned. Every engagement taught us something new about modern warfare. The Ukrainian military underwent a revolution from within. Young officers who had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of Russian artillery and electronic warfare began reimagining how they would fight the next war. They trained relentlessly, modernized their command structures, and developed new tactics. NATO instructors were shocked to find themselves learning as much as they taught. Meanwhile, civil society was transforming just as radically. Volunteer organizations sprang up to support the military, creating networks that would prove invaluable in 2022. Professionals developed secure communication systems. Civilians learned combat medicine. A generation of veterans returned from the Donbass with battle experience and a burning determination to never again be caught unprepared. The most crucial change, however, was psychological. The old Soviet mentality of waiting for orders from above gave way to a culture of initiative and adaptability. Junior officers were empowered to make battlefield decisions. Civilians learned to organize themselves without government direction. Ukraine was becoming something Putin couldn't comprehend, a society where strength flowed from the bottom up, not the top down. By 2021, Ukraine's military ranked only 22nd globally in traditional metrics of power. But these numbers missed something essential: the intangible steel being forged in the national character. While Russian military theorists were writing papers about hybrid warfare, Ukrainians were living it. While Moscow was building a military designed to intimidate, Kyiv was building one designed to survive. The results would soon reshape geopolitics. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion, expecting to find a weak state ripe for conquest, he instead encountered a nation that had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this fight. The massive army that had terrorized military planners for decades was about to meet its match in the most unlikely of places, a country whose very existence as an independent nation its leader denied. Ukraine wasn't just ready for war. It had already been fighting one for 8 years. The world just hadn't noticed yet Putin's strategic misjudgment and Ukraine's resilience. On a snowy Moscow afternoon in December 2021, Vladimir Putin sat at his now infamous long white table, surrounded by maps of Ukraine. His military chiefs had just finished a presentation outlining what they promised would be a 3-day operation to decapitate the Ukrainian government. The plan had a certain elegant simplicity. Special forces would seize Hostomel Airport outside Kyiv, creating an air bridge for elite paratroopers to land and storm the capital. President Zelenskyy would flee, resistance would collapse, and a pro-Russian government would be installed before the West could react. "Their soldiers won't even have time to lace their boots," boasted General Valery Gerasimov, chief of Russia's general staff. Putin's intelligence services had painted a picture he desperately wanted to believe. They claimed Ukrainian troops would surrender en masse. Local officials would defect. Civilians would greet Russian soldiers with flowers. It was a fantasy built on layers of self-deception, where every analyst knew telling the truth could end their career, or worse. The reality that awaited Russia's invasion force couldn't have been more different. At 4 a.m. on February 24th, the first missiles streaked across Ukraine's dark sky. Russian helicopter gunships roared toward Hostomel Airport, carrying elite VDV paratroopers. What should have been a textbook operation immediately went wrong. Ukrainian intelligence had been tracking the buildup for months. Surface-to-air missiles knocked several helicopters from the sky. The survivors landed to find themselves facing not raw recruits, but hardened Ukrainian special forces who had anticipated exactly this move. "We knew they would come for Hostomel," recalled Lieutenant Andriy Kovalchuk of Ukraine's 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade. "The only question was when. When they finally came, we were ready." The battle for the airport became a microcosm of the larger war. Russian forces, operating on rigid Soviet-era doctrine, found themselves outmaneuvered by Ukrainian units practicing flexible, decentralized warfare. While Russian commanders waited for orders from Moscow, Ukrainian junior officers made snap decisions on the ground. The elite VDV troops, meant to be the spearhead of a lightning victory, instead became the harbinger of a strategic disaster. Meanwhile, Russia's much-vaunted electronic warfare systems proved largely ineffective against Ukraine's mix of high-tech Western equipment and low-tech adaptability. Ukrainian troops simply switched to encrypted Starlink communications when their radios were jammed, or used runners when necessary. Every problem was met with improvisation rather than paralysis. The myth of Russian military invincibility began to unravel in real time. Columns of Russian tanks, advancing without proper infantry support, were ambushed by small Ukrainian units wielding Western anti-tank weapons. The Russians' secure communication systems failed so completely that some commanders resorted to using unsecured cell phones, allowing Ukrainian intelligence to locate and eliminate several high-ranking officers. But perhaps Putin's greatest miscalculation was about the Ukrainian people themselves. In Kherson, civilians stood in front of Russian tanks, armed with nothing but their courage and yellow-blue flags. In Sumy, ordinary citizens used Google Maps to report Russian troop movements to the Ukrainian military. Farmers towed away abandoned Russian vehicles with tractors, creating social media memes that would damage Russian prestige as effectively as any military defeat. The legend of the Ghost of Kyiv, a mythical Ukrainian ace pilot, spread across social media. While military experts quickly identified it as propaganda, they missed the larger point. Ukraine was winning the information war. Every shared story, whether strictly true or not, strengthened national resolve and undermined Russian morale. By the end of the first week, Russia's three-day war was already a strategic failure. The Western intelligence estimates that had predicted Kyiv's rapid fall were being hastily revised. A new reality was emerging. Ukraine wasn't just fighting for survival, it was rewriting the rules of modern warfare in real time. In his bunker beneath Moscow, Putin faced a truth his yes-men had never dared tell him. His army wasn't fighting the corrupted shell of a nation he'd imagined, but rather a people who had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this moment. His special military operation had awakened something his intelligence services failed to detect, a nation fully prepared to bet its existence on victory. The war was only beginning, but its fundamental character had already been set. Russia would be fighting not just Ukraine's army, but its entire society. And that society had decided collectively and irrevocably that surrender was not an option. Ukraine's digital warfare revolution. When Russian missiles struck Ukraine's communications infrastructure in the invasion's opening hours, they expected to plunge the country into digital darkness. Instead, they accidentally catalyzed one of the most remarkable technological adaptations in military history. Mikhailo Fedorov, Ukraine's youngest cabinet minister at 31, fired off a tweet to Elon Musk while huddled in a Kyiv basement. While you try to colonize Mars, Russia tried to occupy Ukraine. While your rockets successfully land from space, Russian rockets attack Ukrainian civil people. Within days, thousands of Starlink terminals were streaming into Ukraine. SpaceX engineers worked frantically to update the system's software, hardening it against Russian jamming attempts. Ukrainian troops mounted Starlink dishes on their vehicles, creating mobile command posts that could coordinate artillery strikes from anywhere with a view of the sky. The future of warfare was being improvised on the fly. The Russians expected us to go blind and deaf, recalled Colonel Yaroslav Honchar of Ukraine's Drone Reconnaissance Unit. Instead, we gained capabilities they couldn't match. Our soldiers were sharing targeting data on Telegram, while their commanders were still waiting for paper maps. But Starlink was just the beginning. Ukraine's tech-savvy population transformed the battlefield in ways military theorists had never imagined. It professionals who had once built apps for Silicon Valley now developed secure battlefield communication systems. Gamers used their joystick skills to pilot drones. Teenagers with smartphones became an intelligence network that even the CIA envied. The drone revolution proved particularly devastating. Ukrainian forces modified commercial drones with thermal cameras and simple release mechanisms, turning $1,000 quadcopters into precision bombing platforms. They developed encrypted control systems that could resist Russian jamming. When they captured Russian armor, they discovered their improvised weapons had forced Moscow's tank commanders to weld improvised cage armor onto their vehicles, a medieval solution to a 21st century threat. Every morning we'd wake up to new videos from our drone teams, said Sergeant Katerina Polishchuk, an artillery commander. We'd see exactly where Russian forces had moved overnight, what equipment they had, even which tanks were low on fuel based on their heat signatures. It was like having X-ray vision. Zelenskyy's government weaponized social media with surgical precision. While Russian propagandists crafted elaborate disinformation campaigns, Ukraine's president posted selfie videos from the streets of Kyiv, proving his continued presence in the capital. Each address was a masterclass in digital leadership, informal, authentic, and carefully crafted to resonate across cultural boundaries. The impact extended far beyond morale. Ukrainian coders developed apps that allowed civilians to report Russian troop movements with a few taps on their phones. Artillery units received targeting data from teenagers on bicycles. Facial recognition software, controversially repurposed from commercial applications, helped identify Russian soldiers killed in action, allowing Ukraine to notify their families directly, a psychological operation that struck at the heart of Russian morale. Even Ukraine's mistakes proved innovative. When a Ukrainian soldier posted a selfie from a trencher, he accidentally revealed his unit's position. Within hours, Russian artillery struck the location. But Ukrainian IT specialists turned this lesson into an advantage, deliberately seeding social media with misleading posts that led Russian forces into ambushes. In Moscow's military academies, officers had studied network-centric warfare as a theoretical concept. In Ukraine, civilians with laptops and smartphones were actually doing it. Every Ukrainian citizen with a mobile phone became a potential sensor in a vast intelligence network. Every social media post became a potential piece of battlefield intelligence. The Russians brought a 20th century army to a 21st century fight, observed British military analyst Sir Richard Barons. They found themselves fighting not just Ukraine's military, but its entire digital society. By summer, even Russian military bloggers were admiringly referring to Ukraine's digital swarm tactics. The same nation that had given the Soviet Union many of its best programmers was now using those skills to defeat Moscow's armies. In the process, they weren't just defending their territory, they were writing the textbook for future digital warfare. The revolution wasn't just technological, it was cultural. Ukraine's military embraced a level of digital innovation that would have given most NATO commanders heartburn. They accepted the risks of using commercial technology because they understood something fundamental. In an existential fight, perfect security matters less than perfect adaptability. And in that adaptability lay the seeds of survival. The People's War, Ukraine's grassroots resistance. In the basement of a bombed-out school building in Kharkiv, 67-year-old chemistry teacher Olena Petrenko stirred a pot of explosive ingredients with the same careful precision she once used to demonstrate reactions to her students. Around her, a dozen women, former accountants, shopkeepers, and retirees carefully filled glass bottles with the mixture. "I never imagined I would teach Molotov cocktail chemistry," she mused, adjusting her reading glasses. "But then again, I never imagined the Russians would shell my classroom." Across Ukraine, similar scenes of everyday resilience played out with remarkable frequency. A ballerina in Odessa organized evacuation convoys. A Kyiv software developer converted his company's office into a drone repair facility. A teenager used his PlayStation controller to pilot reconnaissance drones over Russian positions. The transformation was most visible in Ukraine's Territorial Defense Forces, a volunteer military organization that expanded from 10,000 to over 100,000 members in the span of weeks. Among them was Vasyl Shevchenko, a former barista who found himself commanding a checkpoint in Kyiv's suburbs. "On February 23rd, I was making lattes. On the 24th, I was learning to operate an anti-tank weapon," he recalled. "By March, I had destroyed 2 Russian armored vehicles." Life changes fast in wartime. The international response proved equally extraordinary. Veterans from 52 countries formed the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine. Among them was former US Marine Sarah Anderson, who arrived expecting to find chaos, but instead discovered remarkable organization. These civilians had better operational security than some military units I've served with, she noted. The babushka selling vegetables at the corner store could tell you more about Russian troop movements than some intelligence officers. That grandmother represented a unique Ukrainian phenomenon, the babushka battalion. Elderly women, seemingly harmless, became one of Ukraine's most effective intelligence networks. They watched Russian movements from their garden plots, passed information through encrypted apps their grandchildren had installed on their phones, and sometimes engaged in more direct resistance. In occupied Melitopol, 73-year-old Maria Kovalenko became a legend for walking up to Russian soldiers and secretly marking their vehicles with infrared paint visible to Ukrainian drones. "They thought I was just a confused old woman asking for directions," she said later. "They never searched my pockets." The resistance took creative forms. Kyiv's finest restaurants converted into military kitchens, with Michelin-trained chefs preparing thousands of meals for soldiers and civilians. Seamstresses switched from wedding dresses to camouflage nets. Hunters became trainers, teaching urban professionals how to move through forests undetected. Underground networks emerged with startling efficiency. In occupied territories, civilians developed elaborate codes to share information about Russian positions. A particular arrangement of laundry on a balcony might indicate the presence of a command post. A window with specific curtain patterns could signal safe houses for partisans. The occupation unleashed a wave of creative resistance. In Kherson, a dentist passed intelligence to Ukrainian forces by embedding coded messages in dental X-rays sent to colleagues in free territory. A high school math teacher created a system for tracking Russian supply movements using chess notation in seemingly innocent social media posts about local tournaments. Perhaps most remarkably, Ukraine's civil society remained functional even under intense pressure. When Russian forces disrupted government services, volunteer networks seamlessly filled the gaps. Local business owners converted their warehouses into aid distribution centers. IT professionals created ad hoc systems for coordinating humanitarian relief. The cost was immense. Every Ukrainian interviewed for this chapter had lost someone. But the shared sacrifice seemed to strengthen rather than break their resolve. As one Kharkiv resident put it, "The more they try to break us, the more unbreakable we become." This was Putin's ultimate miscalculation. His Soviet-era understanding of power saw only vertical structures: governments, armies, official hierarchies. He never grasped that Ukraine's true strength lay in its horizontal bonds, the millions of individual citizens who chose day after day to resist. A Ukrainian soldier, asked about the difference between the opposing forces, summed it up succinctly: "The Russians are fighting for a man. We are fighting for each other." In that simple truth lay the key to understanding why David was beating Goliath. Western Arsenal, Ukraine's innovative military transformation. In a pine forest outside Kyiv, Lieutenant Sofia Romaniuk stood before a HIMARS rocket launcher, remembering her first encounter with the system. 3 weeks to learn what should take 6 months, she said, running her hand along the launcher's steel frame. We didn't have time for perfectionism. The Russians were firing 20 artillery shells for every one of ours. That disparity was about to change dramatically. The arrival of HIMARS, High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, in June marked a turning point that military historians would later compare to the arrival of Lend-Lease equipment in World War II. But the true revolution wasn't in the technology itself, it was in how Ukraine employed it. American trainers were stunned when Ukrainian forces began using HIMARS in ways their own doctrine hadn't envisioned. Rather than deploying the systems in traditional fire bases, Ukrainian crews kept them constantly mobile, emerging from forest cover to launch precision strikes before disappearing again. They called it the HIMARS carousel. "The Americans taught us the manual," Romaniuk explained. "We wrote a new one." This pattern repeated across every category of Western aid. Ukrainian forces took NATO doctrine as a starting point rather than a constraint. They mounted French anti-tank missiles on dune buggies, integrated British night vision systems with commercial drones, and created hybrid command systems that merged Soviet-era equipment with cutting-edge Western technology. The logistics behind this transformation were staggering. A secret network of bases across Poland became the heart of what diplomats called the arsenal of democracy. C-17 transport planes landed around the clock, carrying everything from Javelin missiles to medical supplies. Ukrainian railways, running under constant threat of Russian strikes, moved this massive arsenal to the front lines with remarkable efficiency. But the most crucial Western contribution wasn't hardware, it was knowledge. NATO instructors, operating from bases in Poland and Germany, compressed years of training into weeks. Ukrainian officers learned new tactics alongside the technical details of Western systems, creating hybrid warfare doctrines that merged NATO precision with Ukrainian creativity. The results shocked military observers. Ukrainian forces began conducting hunter-killer operations that combined Soviet-era tanks with Western anti-tank teams. They used American counter-battery radars to direct Soviet artillery pieces. Each Western system became a force multiplier for existing Ukrainian capabilities. The transformation wasn't smooth. Early Western reluctance to provide certain weapon systems frustrated Ukrainian commanders. Colonel Mikhailo Fedorov remembered arguing with NATO advisors about the need for longer-range missiles. "They worried about escalation," he recalled. "We worried about survival." But as Ukraine proved its ability to use Western systems effectively, the aid flow expanded. British Storm Shadow missiles, German Leopard tanks, and American Patriots joined the arsenal. Each new system required intensive training, creating a constant cycle of Ukrainian units rotating between the front lines and NATO training bases. The impact on Russian forces was devastating. Their advantage in raw artillery numbers meant little against HIMARS strikes that could destroy ammunition dumps 80 kilometers behind the front. Their tank formations designed to overwhelm NATO defenses in Germany proved vulnerable to small Ukrainian teams armed with Western anti-tank weapons. Most crucially, Western intelligence support gave Ukraine unprecedented awareness of Russian movements. Commercial satellite imagery, shared through secure NATO channels, allowed Ukrainian commanders to track Russian deployments in real time. US intelligence aircraft flying along NATO borders provided early warning of Russian missile launches. This marriage of Western technology with Ukrainian innovation produced military capabilities that exceeded the sum of their parts. When Ukrainian forces launched their counteroffensive in Kharkiv, they demonstrated a level of combined arms warfare that stunned NATO observers. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air defense operated with coordination that would have been impossible months earlier. A senior Pentagon official, speaking on condition of anonymity, summed up the transformation. "We gave them the tools. They showed us new ways to use them." The arsenal of democracy had evolved. Instead of simply providing weapons, the West had helped create something unprecedented. A military that combined NATO technology and training with the innovative spirit of a nation fighting for survival. The result was about to demonstrate its full potential on the battlefield. The Kharkiv counteroffensive, a strategic masterstroke. General Valery Zelenskyy stared at the map spread across his command center table in late August 2022. His fingers traced the Russian defensive lines south of Kherson, where Moscow's forces had spent months building what they called an impenetrable fortress. That's exactly what he wanted them to think. In chess, the general would later recall, the winning move is often the one your opponent believes is impossible. While Russian commanders reinforced Kherson, expecting Ukraine's main counteroffensive in the south, Zelenskyy was orchestrating one of the most brilliant deception operations since World War II. The real blow would fall hundreds of kilometers away in the northeastern Kharkiv region, where Russian defenses had been quietly stripped to reinforce the south. The deception was multi-layered. Ukraine openly discussed its upcoming Kherson offensive, leaked plans to sympathetic Western journalists, and made obvious troop movements toward the southern front. Meanwhile, in the forest near Kharkiv, Ukrainian forces gathered in small groups, moving only at night, maintaining strict radio silence. Major Irina Petrova commanded one of these units. "We lived like partisans," she recalled. "No phones, no campfires, no vehicle movements during daylight." The Russians' drone operators reported nothing unusual because there was nothing to see. On September 6th, the trap snapped shut. Ukrainian armor burst through the Russian lines near Bakhmut, exploiting a weakness their enemies never imagined would be tested. The Russian command structure, already struggling with poor communications, collapsed completely. Unit commanders, caught entirely by surprise, retreated without orders rather than face encirclement. The advance moved so quickly that Ukrainian forces had to spray paint navigation arrows on buildings to guide following units. Local civilians emerged from their homes to point out Russian positions and supply dumps. One Ukrainian tank commander described capturing a Russian headquarters where maps and half-finished meals still lay on the tables. "We expected heavy fighting," remembered Colonel Andriy Volkov. "Instead, we found chaos." Russian units were trying to evacuate so quickly they left behind operational tanks with keys still in the ignition. The scale of the Russian collapse exceeded Ukraine's most optimistic projections. In 6 days, Ukrainian forces liberated over 3,000 square kilometers of territory. More importantly, they captured vast stores of Russian ammunition and equipment. Entire ammunition dumps fell intact into Ukrainian hands because their defenders had fled without attempting to destroy them. The psychological impact proved even more significant than the territorial gains. Russian military bloggers, who had maintained an optimistic tone throughout the war, began openly criticizing their military leadership. Some called for the use of tactical nuclear weapons to stem the Ukrainian advance. Others questioned the basic competence of their general staff. Inside the Kremlin, the shock was palpable. Putin had been assured that Russian forces were containing Ukrainian offensive capabilities. Instead, his army had suffered its most significant defeat since World War II. Within days, he would announce a mobilization that would send hundreds of thousands of unprepared recruits to the front, a desperate measure that revealed the extent of Russia's military crisis. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Kharkiv offensive was its efficiency. Ukrainian forces suffered minimal casualties while inflicting devastating losses on the Russians. They demonstrated a level of operational art that prompted NATO officers to start studying Ukrainian tactical innovations. A French military attaché in Kyiv observed, "They didn't just win a battle, they rewrote the manual on modern maneuver warfare." The liberation of Kharkiv revealed something else: the human cost of Russian occupation. As Ukrainian forces entered freed villages, they discovered evidence of war crimes that would shock the world's conscience. But they also found an unbroken people. In every liberated town, Ukrainian flags emerged from hiding places. Citizens who had endured months of occupation greeted their liberators with tears, hugs, and vital intelligence about remaining Russian positions. The Kharkiv counteroffensive marked more than just a military victory. It demonstrated that Ukraine had transformed from a defensive force into one capable of complex offensive operations. An army that began the war fighting for survival was now fighting for victory. Moscow's dream of a quick conquest had become a nightmare of strategic defeat. But for Ukraine, the hardest battle still lay ahead: the Battle of Bakhmut, a testament to innovation and resilience. The winter wind howled through the ruins of Bakhmut, carrying the perpetual thunder of artillery. Captain Mariana Bazula peered through a thermal scope at the approaching Russian forces, her breath freezing in the pre-dawn air. "They're coming again," she whispered into her radio. "Same pattern as yesterday." The Battle of Bakhmut would become a symbol of both the war's brutality and Ukraine's innovative adaptation to sustained combat. What began as a tactical engagement evolved into a meat grinder that would consume Russia's best remaining units, including the infamous Wagner Group. They called it the Bakhmut Fortress, Bazula recalled. But it wasn't just one fortress. Every building, every basement, every pile of rubble was its own fortress. We made them pay for every meter. Ukraine's defense of the city represented warfare's future colliding with its past. Drone operators directed artillery from tablet computers while soldiers fought room to room with knives and grenades. First-person view, FPV drones, modified with explosive charges, hunted Russian tanks through the city's shattered streets, while snipers engaged in duels that would have been familiar to soldiers from Stalingrad. The innovation came in layers. Ukrainian forces developed a system they called the Hive. Multiple small units operating independently, but sharing a common tactical picture through encrypted communications. When Russian forces breached one position, they found themselves under attack from 3 others. Traditional military doctrine says urban warfare favors the defender 3-1, explained Major Viktor Kovalenko. We made it 6-1, then 10-1. We turned every Russian advantage into a liability. The cost was staggering. Both sides fired more artillery rounds at Bakhmut than were used in the entire First Gulf War. But Ukraine's defenders discovered new ways to survive the onslaught. They dug what they called metro stations, deep bunkers connected by tunnels that allowed them to move under the Russian barrages. They developed a rotation system that cycled units through the front lines every 3 days, preventing combat fatigue from degrading their effectiveness. Innovation emerged from necessity. When Russian electronic warfare systems began jamming their drones, Ukrainian operators started using old Soviet radio frequencies, knowing the Russians couldn't jam them without disrupting their own communications. When ammunition ran low, they developed precision artillery techniques that cut shell consumption by 60% while maintaining effectiveness. The Russians thought they could win through pure attrition, said Colonel Olena Matvienko. They didn't understand that we were getting stronger even as we fought. Behind the front lines, Ukraine's defense industry underwent a revolutionary transformation. Factories working round the clock produced modified Soviet equipment compatible with NATO ammunition. Tech startups developed new drone designs weekly. A network of 3D printing workshops produced everything from periscopes to mortar fins. The Western alliance faced its own challenges maintaining support. As the war dragged on, some voices called for pushing Ukraine toward negotiations. But the defenders of Bakhmut had already decided that question for themselves. We're not just holding a city, explained Sergeant Yulia Dominik, commanding a drone unit in the city's northern sector. We're holding the line between 2 worlds, one where might makes right and one where nations choose their own path. The battle's turning point came not from a single dramatic event, but from the cumulative effect of Ukrainian adaptation. Russian forces, still operating on Soviet-era doctrine, found themselves facing an enemy that evolved faster than they could adapt. Their attacks became predictable, their tactics stale, while Ukrainian defenders continued to innovate. By spring, military analysts calculated that Russia had lost more troops trying to take Bakhmut than the Soviet Union lost in its entire Afghan war. But the city's greater significance lay in what it represented. Ukraine's transformation from an army that could survive to one that could sustain long-term combat operations against a numerically superior enemy. The defenders had done more than hold a city. They had demonstrated that Ukraine's military revolution was irreversible. Every lesson learned in Bakhmut's ruins would be applied elsewhere along the front. Every innovation would be refined and improved. A Ukrainian soldier, writing in his journal during the battle's darkest days, captured its essence. They thought they could break us with numbers. Instead, they made us invent new ways to be unbreakable. The war's outcome remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: Ukraine had changed the nature of modern warfare. The question was no longer whether it could survive, but how its innovations would reshape military thinking for decades to come. The price of freedom: Ukraine's transformation through conflict. Standing amid the reconstruction of Kyiv's Maidan Square in early 2024, the cost of Ukraine's resistance was etched in every rebuilt facade and every new air raid shelter. But so was its triumph of will. We didn't just defend our land, reflected Maria Kovtun, now a battalion commander who'd fought in 3 major campaigns. We redefined what it means to be Ukrainian, what it means to be free. The statistics told one story. Over 500,000 casualties on both sides, millions displaced, entire cities reduced to rubble. But beneath these numbers lay a more profound transformation. Ukraine had emerged as something unprecedented, a society that had turned total mobilization into total innovation. The war's impact rippled far beyond Ukraine's borders. Military theorists from Tokyo to London pored over its lessons. The era of tank warfare wasn't over, they concluded, but it had been revolutionized. The dominance of conventional artillery had been challenged by cheap drones and precision strikes. Most importantly, the assumption that larger armies inevitably defeat smaller ones had been shattered. Ukraine didn't just resist with weapons, observed General Sir Richard Shirreff, former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander. They resisted with ideas. Every Ukrainian became an innovator by necessity. The innovations spread across society. Architects designed buildings with built-in bomb shelters that doubled as community centers. Software developers created apps that turned civil defense into a form of social networking. Even Ukraine's agriculture adapted, with farmers developing automated systems to detect and avoid unexploded ordnance during harvests. In Washington, Pentagon planners rewrote military doctrine based on Ukraine's experiences. The war had demonstrated that future conflicts would be won not just by superior weapons, but by superior adaptability. Ukraine's network warfare, combining military units, civilian volunteers, and international supporters into a single resistant force, became a model studied worldwide. But the most profound changes were cultural. Ukrainian society, tested by fire, had developed new forms of resilience. Every school now taught drone operation alongside traditional subjects. Civilian defense training became as common as sports clubs. The line between soldier and citizen had blurred, creating what sociologists called a resistant society. "We learned that freedom isn't just something you have," said Yulia Panovnik, a former teacher who'd led a civilian reconnaissance unit. "It's something you reinvent every day." The war transformed geopolitics. Russia's myth of military supremacy lay shattered. The era of territorial conquest through sheer force appeared to be closing. A new model of national defense had emerged, one based not on the size of standing armies but on society's capacity for total mobilization and innovation. Yet amid these strategic shifts, the human story remained most compelling. In liberated territories, communities rebuilt not just buildings but social bonds. People who had spent months in occupation emerged with a fierce appreciation for democracy's value. They had seen the alternative up close. "You don't really understand freedom until someone tries to take it away," observed Oleksandr Ponomarenko, a teenager who'd used his gaming skills to become one of Ukraine's most effective drone operators. "Then you understand, it's worth any price." That price was visible everywhere. In the memorial walls covered with photographs of the fallen, in the children who had lost parents, in the amputees learning to use advanced prosthetics. But so was the pride of a nation that had discovered its own strength. Ukraine's example rippled through history, joining the ranks of legendary resistances, the Spanish against Napoleon, the Finns against the Soviets, the Vietnamese against multiple superpowers. But Ukraine had done more than resist. It had shown how a society could transform itself through resistance, turning existential threat into evolutionary leap. In the end, Ukraine's greatest victory wasn't just military. It was proving that in the age of drones and cyber war, the human spirit remained the most powerful weapon of all. They had shown that a nation fighting for its existence could innovate faster than a superpower fighting for conquest. The war's final chapter remained unwritten. But Ukraine had already won something more valuable than territory. It had won its future. In doing so, it had written a new chapter in the history of warfare, democracy, and human resilience. A nation that many couldn't find on a map had become a blueprint for freedom's defense in the 21st century.